I remember my platoon sergeant, literally grabbing me by the throat when I managed an action on and an ambush incorrectly. And I believed him at the time that he would me and leave me on the ground if I did that on tour. I remember having a conversation with my company commander and saying, oh, Phil, have you thought about maybe doing it like this? And he listened to me. You've got to be ready to have that humility and not be too rigid about how you want to do things. I mean, the most intelligent person in my platoon was a territorial army soldier who joined us 2 weeks before, and he used to whisper to me about stuff that needed to happen, and you have to have that sort of humility. There are senior officers in the army and the wider armed forces at the moment who will tell you to your face without irony that we will be in a conventional war in the next 3 to 5 years. When it gets nasty, people do look to you. Have the mindset that you're joining to go to war, otherwise I think your actions and your preparedness is wrong.
Welcome back to the podcast, the Lessons in Leadership podcast. And today, this is a conversation I've really been looking forward to. When you look through my content, if you venture through my YouTube channel, it's very pro-military, and I am passionate about military service being really beneficial for a lot of people out there. But it's mainly training focused because that was the bulk of my experience. I want to bring you a bit more detail for what the realities of war really entails. And there's probably not many people better suited to bring this version of events to you from a junior officer perspective than my guest today. So firstly, Sam, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for giving up your time.
Thanks very much.
It's currently 20 to 6 in the evening, so thanks very much. I appreciate it. Do you just want to give a quick intro to yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Sam Perrin. I joined the army in 2005 after a couple of attempts, which we'll, I think, get into. I did platoon commander's battle course in early 2006, and then I was very fortunate to lead a platoon of soldiers on high intensity operations in the summer of 2007. So I had that sort of quite unique experience of having a warfighting tour as a junior officer, which is the ambition of most infantry platoon commanders. I then very quickly thereafter did special forces selection, and then spent the remainder of my career there. And in total, I did 10 years in the army. And I'm now 12 years into a career in the private sector. I work in telecoms.
Awesome. In a leadership capacity.
Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll probably get into how the army set you up for success there. But there's also a link here that I just want to sort of make sure that people understand is Sam and I basically commanded the same platoon probably about 10 years apart, to be honest. I took over 2017, I think. 10 platoon, C Company, 1 Royal Anglian. And Sam's name was sort of etched into some of the 10 platoon history, for which we'll probably get into why there was a good platoon reputation anyway. So, Sam, thanks for joining. And I'd like to maybe start at the start, makes a lot of sense, as to why you joined the army in the first place.
Yeah, so I never wanted to do anything else. I was extremely inspired by my mum's dad, my grandpa, who had done effectively 5 years. He was one of the very first tranches of people to be called up during the Second World War. He'd done a significant amount of stuff all the way through Africa, all the way up through Europe. We talk about 6-month tours now or 12-month tours now, and he did a sort of a five-year tour sort of thing, and he'd done some interesting stuff. So that probably is what sort of indoctrinated me as a young boy. And if you'd spoken to me as a teenager, it was always what I wanted to do. Although I would say I knew that it was something I wanted to do as a young man. So I never saw it as I didn't want to be a general. I didn't want to do the full sort of 22, 25 years. I saw it as a thing to do in my 20s, to do a lot of fun stuff and experience a lot of things and experience leadership. It was always the infantry. I've always been very, very sporty, grew up in the countryside, sort of, it was always the thing that I wanted to do. That's not to say that there aren't superb careers to be offered in the cause, but for me, infantry operations is the thing to do if you want to join the army. And it far exceeded my expectations. When people find out that I left the army fairly early, only 10 years, and people tend to think that people do a bit longer. They always assume that must have been because I'd had a negative experience. The reality is it was the most fabulous experience of my life. I loved every second, but I got to do everything that I wanted to do in my career. I got to do 3 operational tours. I was almost entirely in command of soldiers. Throughout that time, working with soldiers, never got put behind a desk. So I was very, very lucky that in 9-10 years I got to do everything I wanted to do, and I left on my own terms, and I would recommend it to absolutely anybody.
It's funny, I get, obviously I put a lot of stuff out online, and I regularly get chewed out by some veterans for only serving 6 years. But that was my experience. I didn't do 3, I did 1 operational tour. And at the time, that was kind of the best thing that the regular army had going for it, an op toral. But I very much knew that I was never going to serve for, decades. And it was actually a part of me when I no longer was commanding soldiers and had that opportunity to lead in sort of the leadership sense that I joined for. It was a fairly easy decision to sort of maybe walk away from it. And it sounds like there were similar reasons there, as that leadership, and especially in the infantry where you are with your men or with your soldiers a lot of the time, was what really interested me. If I can take you back to the Army Officer Selection Board, most of the people watching this might have it coming up. Yeah. And I know you've helped people prepare for this in the past, and obviously that's a big part of what I do.
Yeah.
What was your experience like back when you did it, and do you think it's changed?
Yeah, so I'll just do my own personal story very quickly. So I applied for a bursary. I don't know if that's still something that happens now, but it would have been something like, £2,500 a year for the 3 years that I was at, so £7,500 total. I applied for that when I was about 16, 17. School sponsored me through it. It was a fairly sort of extensive process, and I failed it miserably. As in, it wasn't close. I left there knowing that I'd failed it, and actually that's probably the first thing I want to sort of mention to everybody who's listening is, I ended up having an amazing career, did some cool stuff, and I actually failed at my first attempt. Now I was far too young, and ultimately I needed to grow up. I needed to sort of grow into my body a little bit and read more books and get a bit more life experience, do some travelling, and I did some territorial army stuff at university that really sort of helped me to sort of grow as a man and as a young leader. But yeah, I failed my first attempt, and so I would say to anybody here who and lots of people do fail. It's a pretty high standard that they drive, rightly so. Don't give up and keep going, because you're a very different person as an 18-year-old than you are as a 22-year-old, as a 23. And sometimes you need to wait until you've matured a little bit to go. So that's the sort of the first point I would just make in terms of reflecting my own experience. I then did AOSB in my 3rd year of university, so I would have been 21, 22. I was a completely different person. I'd grown up sort of significantly. The only thing that I was really anxious about was the mental arithmetic. I was fixated and obsessed with. My undergrad is history. I'd always done. I'd never done particularly sciences or maths or anything, and I was just genuinely terrified about someone asking me a speed distance time calculation and getting that wrong. And I spent a lot of time. I got private tutoring and tried to learn loads of different sort of clever techniques. And I think probably on my AOSB, and again, that was when would that have been, 2004 or something, I got asked 3 different mental arithmetic questions during different planning exercises and things, and I got 2 of them right, and the 3rd one I completely froze. And I had to look the directing staff in the eye and say, I'm sorry, sir, I don't know the answer to that. And that's another sort of interesting point, which is, don't be afraid to say you don't know. I know lots of people who would stand there stuttering and worrying that it's better to say something than nothing. Actually, they're looking for someone who's authentic and honest and that sort of thing. So well over 50% of my preparation and worry was about the mental arithmetic, and I got some of it right, and another one I got it wrong, but it was almost an opportunity to show a strength in my character, which was the honesty and the authenticity, rather than sort of trying to bluff it. So again, turning those weaknesses into strengths is a bit of a knack that AOSB can create opportunities for. I prepared very, very hard for the FIS. So back then it was I can't even remember what it was, an 800-meter run, press ups and sit ups. And at that time they stopped you when you get to the standard, whatever it is, 50 press ups, 50 sit ups. I can't remember what it was. And my ambition was to be the first one to finish, because you could spend, I've got 2 minutes, this is easy. I wanted to be the first one to finish and the first one to stand up at both the briefing course and the AOSB. And so really preparing the mental arithmetic, preparing for the physical tests were the 2 main things that I sort of focused on. And there's probably sort of a third segment as well, which is sort of more the marginal gains stuff. Obviously, marginal gains is a famous expression, now massively overused, made famous by David Brailsford and the Team Sky, Bradley Wiggins and Froome and Cavendish days. But what are the microscopic changes that you can make to be better? So I focused quite a lot on how I would shake people's hand, on the suit that I would wear, my shoes, little marginal things that would differentiate me from my it's not a competitive place. If you all meet the standard, you all pass. But I thought very carefully about how I could set myself apart from the others. And I'm sort of not really for overcoaching people in this process, but everybody knows exactly what the routine is, and they know the psychometric tests and essays and planning exercises and command tasks and yada yada. Always thinking about how you can add those little extra nuances in there and little things that show you're the most prepared, I think is a good way of doing it. So I had a disastrous start, really genuinely disastrous start. Like I'm amazed if I got like a single point on any of the exercises. Current affairs fail, phys fail, obstacle course fail, command task fail. Like it was awful, and quite embarrassing for my school actually, because they put a lot of effort into getting me ready. And then I found AOSB as a 22-year-old. I didn't find it all that challenging because I was a different person, more mature, more physically able, and I'd prepared very, very hard for it.
And you knew, you had that experience, you kind of knew what was coming up at that point. I sometimes think main board, sorry, I'm wrestling with my mic here because it just keeps dropping. I sometimes think main board is slightly easier, even though the assessments are slightly harder. I sometimes think it's slightly easier than briefing because, one, it lasts longer, so you actually can settle into it a bit more. So you're not in and out, you actually get a few days there and you can relax with your syndicate. And I think if you spend a week with people and you have that innate leadership ability, it will come out just in the, in the bar in the evening or whatever, people will look to you. And the second part is, you've been to Westbury, you kind of know how it works and it's a little bit less intimidating. With the maths, I sort of say to people, if you fuck the maths up, do you really think they're going to say no if you've got potential in other areas? Probably not, but again, great to prepare.
Yeah, and it's and just on that point again, it's an opportunity to see whether you go to Peters under pressure. Not many people are naturally good at mental arithmetic. Speed, distance, time calculations are challenging, particularly when you're under stress and under pressure. So it's as much an opportunity to show that you've got a bit of backbone and a bit of presence and that the body language stays strong and all of that, than it is a test of your mental aptitude as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were two other things about sort of the way you dress, the way you appear, the way you shake people's hands. There was a sign above the gym at Sandhurst when I went there. And I don't know if it's still there. If it is there, please, if anyone's there now, let me know. But you only get one chance to make a good first impression. And that's so true and is said throughout the military. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last piece there, which I've spoken about a lot recently actually, is this idea of aggression and what that actually means in different contexts. And your drive to be the first stood up, your drive to win the fizz and do well on that. I think that is kind of that aggression, that controlled aggression coming through. Determination, you could call it a few different things. But I say to people sometimes that are going down to AOSB, you kind of got to have a bit about you as well, especially if we think of, and you've seen it, right? You've delivered it, is what the job actually could entail for people. That's important to have that somewhere in your locker, even if it's quite raw at that stage. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think to develop that slightly, just on the fizz point and then more broadly, so the worst thing you could do to prepare for a career as a young officer would be to fixate on the AOSB standards, because they are frankly embarrassing. The bleep test standard is I wrote it down. What's the bleep test standard now?
710.
710, which is, that's barely a jog. I mean, it's really, really, really terrible that they've had to reduce the standard like that. And I think, if you're imagining in 18 months' time being in command of soldiers, working with soldiers, you want to be in the 12, 13 range to have, to be up in the top third of certainly an infantry unit. You want to be, I don't know, you're more current than me, but I would think 12, 13 would be sort of minimum for a young officer to have the respect of their
13 and above, I would say.
And then the big test at Sandhurst, it was 2.4k when I was in, but it's now a 2k run. You don't want to be anything more than about 8 minutes 30 on that to have any opportunity of going to the better organisations and indeed, have the credibility in front of your soldiers. So, I think fixating on the selection is the wrong thing to do. You want to fixate on what is it that will make me a good leader, and try and be ready for that. I personally don't think Sandhurst is, and we'll get onto it, but I don't think Sandhurst is the thing that's preparing you to be a leader. I think you should be ready when you start, and then you're honing and optimising rather than allowing Sandhurst to create you into this brand new person. Like, really, you want to be sort of 80% there, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Certainly physically, you want to be 80% there.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a 50% pass at AOSB, and while Sandhurst is a development course, they're going to train you, they're going to develop this sort of raw ability, if you like. They aren't just opening their gates to anyone. You need to be able to bring something to the table. Also, small dit, I guess. He's now a colour sergeant instructor at Sandhurst, but one of my corporals, when we used to have POs come and visit, potential officers come and visit, and he was about, I used to put them on fizz with him. Because I'd be like, okay, he'll put you through your paces. And he did. And it was very easy to see who'd prepared and who hadn't. So it's a warning shot. Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to Sandhurst then, because you touched on it. I've heard you speak about this on another podcast, which I'll link in the description. What was your experience like, and is it fit for purpose?
I mean, it self-evidently is, because the British Army has been doing the business for, decades. And Sandhurst is one of the core leadership schools, along with, where all the various corps do their leadership training and things like that. So I'm going to be quite nuanced in how I answer that question, but I would fundamentally say that it does work. I mean, I was unbelievably focused on doing well at Sandhurst. I separated myself from my family and friends. I tried to create remove as many sort of impediments and barriers as possible, so that I could focus. I didn't go home at weekends, and I was probably a bit of a weirdo, and I wanted to maximise the experience, and actually I found it wanting in terms of what I wanted from it. I was 100% infantry focused, and I sound extremely arrogant, and and I was a pretty precocious and arrogant 23, 24-year-old, but I wanted more. I wanted more test. I wanted more fizz. I wanted more soldiering. I wanted more development opportunities. And I'm not qualified to say that they need to reduce this and increase that and change the what would you call it, the portfolio or whatever. But I was pretty disappointed at Sandhurst. I came out of Sandhurst less fit than when I went in. I was lucky in that I was a January intake, and so from the point of graduating university, I couldn't get on the September intake. I tried, but it was full, and so my dad very kindly paid for me to have a gym membership, and I just trained and I got very, very fit. So I found it disappointing physically. And there's a bell curve of capability, which if you're well prepared, you're going to be frustrated when you're doing platoon level stuff and even section level stuff. I thought that I didn't want to spend quite as much time in the classroom.
Yeah.
And actually I was let down by, I just happened to have a fairly difficult experience with my directing staff. So I had generational colour sergeant and platoon commander when in junior term, generational people. Lex Roberts was my platoon commander, who had been earmarked to run William and Harry's platoon. So he was like the top platoon commander. Harry was supposed to be in our platoon, but it changed. But anyway, that's just a sense that Lex was a generational leader, and Colour Sergeant Gibson the same. I mean, I could not have had a more superb set of leaders in the junior term. And then I was less happy with the directing staff. We had a Royal Naval guy as our platoon commander who had never done a 7 questions in his life, and there was a real sort of doctrinal gap. And I understand why they do it, but I felt that go and experiment on somebody else. Thanks. I want someone from the army who can really teach me stuff. And so I did feel a little bit ambivalent about the experience. I mean, 20-year reunion in 6 weeks' time. We're still close as a platoon. We see each other, socially, and the bond was fabulous. And we had some incredibly challenging exercises. Defence X and NBC X and all that sort of stuff. I don't know what they're called now. But I wanted more.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I then went on to be quite so aggressive in my career afterwards, in terms of trying to find an early operational tour and doing selection early and Cambrian patrols and other things that I tried to do, was that I felt a little bit unfulfilled. But yeah, so it does work. It does teach you leadership. It does teach you the technical aspects of leadership. It does teach you some of the doctrinal aspects of leadership. It doesn't teach you much of the pastoral moral component of leadership. I think you get that when you join your organisation and you get poked in the ribs by your platoon sergeant, and you start to learn about what soldiers are like and what they need and how to lead them.
And I'd say really difficult to actually teach that and learn it without almost having to go through it as well.
My core concern was that serve to lead is on the badge, and serve to lead is a huge platitude, but I never really got an articulation of what serve to lead meant in the context of leading soldiers. I didn't have any mentors that were able to really explain that to me, partially as a function of some of the instructors I had and that sort of thing. And again, but it's fine because you join a regiment and you very, very quickly do get to learn. You learn through mistakes and learn through having great mentors.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of things you mentioned there, which I think is really interesting to drill down on. You mentioned separation, sort of separating yourself from the outside world almost. When I was an instructor at ITC, obviously in the more modern era of phones and Snapchat and all this type of stuff, it was toxic for them to have too much contact with home. And I would regularly find them, especially the recruits that were struggling. And it's a slightly different demographic, I understand that, in terms of age as well. But the recruits that were struggling were the ones that were constantly on the phone home. And you almost forget the reasons as to why you've left that behind and what you're trying to achieve. I remember one recruit in particular said, he just wants to leave Harrogate or wherever he was from, and there's nothing for him there. And then 5 weeks in, he'd been on the phone all the time, and he was like, I just want to go back to Harrogate. And I was like, that's a big U-turn.
Yeah.
And then I'll come on to the platoon staff anyway, but that separation, is that something you sort of carried with you in your career, that once you had your mind set on something, you knew the value of boxing off everything else and just being sort of tunnel vision?
Yeah, and by the way, I don't know that that's necessarily the right thing to do. I wasn't a terribly fun person to be around. I was very, very focused on what I wanted to get from my time in the army. And I was very lucky to have a very large and close family, so it was sort of okay. I'll be like, right, see you in a year. I wasn't burning any bridges by doing that. Very, very large friendship group. So I was able to sort of take them for granted slightly because they knew that I was focused on what I was doing, particularly in the first sort of 2 or 3 years of my service. And it's a tricky one because I do exactly the same again, but I don't know that I would advise everyone who's listening to this to be quite so focused. It's perfectly fine to see it as a job and do the basics and be a good person and be professional and all of that. You don't have to be the sort of obnoxious type A that wants to win the Sword of Honour and wants to do selection early and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that is the blueprint. That's who I was, and I got an unbelievably fulfilling career as a function of that. But that's not to say that's the best way to do it. I wasn't going to the bar in the evening. I was, doing God knows what to try and win the Queen's Medal and the Sword of Honour and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not advising people to be like that. And that's the sort of thing, that's in you or it's not. Once you get a bit tired at Sandhurst, particularly in junior term, that's either in you or it's not. So you can think, I'm going to be incredibly focused. And then, if so many people turn up at Sandhurst saying they want to join the Paras, and then 2 weeks in, they're like, oh no, sod that, I'll go somewhere else. So Sandhurst, it filters out the people that, and the tranches of people with different sort of levels of motivation and focus and things like that. But probably being able to flex that is probably a good thing. So if you have, I don't know, a seminal exercise, your first exercise with your platoon, maybe is your first big opportunity to prove yourself, or your first course where, you might start to think about, your annual reports and, are you going to go on and promote and all that sort of stuff. It's probably okay to have a 6-week period here or there where you do turn the phone off and you are focused and that sort of thing. I think that's probably healthy, but switching off from the outside world for long periods of time, I think is probably unhealthy. And I was very lucky that I had a fabulous sort of support group and a quick sort of dip, just to your point about, people that, obviously when I went through, there were no iPhones or anything like that, it's Nokia 3100s and, all that sort of stuff. But I remember on selection, there was a Royal Marine who was, I thought, one of the most handsome men I'd ever met in my life, like the classic sort of essence Royal Marine, who was definitely going to go SBS and had found the course, frankly, easy. He'd been in my room during aptitude, and then he was in my patrol during the trees, which is the phase where you get the most voluntary withdrawals at the early stage, but you get lots of voluntary withdrawals in the jungle as well because it's so challenging. And he was doing really, really well, and he got a letter from home. You get blueies in the trees. And he stood up and he went, "Sam, I'm done." And he VW'd there and then. And it was because he'd got a letter. I still don't know what the letter said. It was something from his girlfriend. But definitely in a scenario there where it's a course where you can take yourself out of it or not. It's just not just an attendance course. It's a course where you have to, where you're being selected. I don't know what would be the equivalent in the Green Army, a sniper's course or a recce course or a course where it's just a pass-fail.
Yeah.
I would find a way to flex yourself out of distractions and leave the phone in your room or whatever it might be, just so that you're focused on what you're trying to do. And I think it removes excuses for quitting or reducing your effort levels.
Yeah. I sort of saw that at Brecon as well, doing the Platoon Commander's Battle course. Was obviously it's dialed down a bit, but it's still an arduous course, still quite challenging. Yeah. And there was one lad good mate of mine, and he was struggling at the time, and he had a girlfriend in London and was doing the trip any weekend he could. And he was coming back a bit late and having to pack his stuff, and it just wasn't doing him any favours. And at that point, I think he would have had the world, done him the world of good to just have a couple of weeks or month to go, I need to focus, and just to have that focus and time back to prepare, because he was deploying sort of, not with his kit squared away and his orders were all over the place, and it was getting difficult.
It's minging. You're there on a Sunday night, it's pissing with rain, you're packing kit for an exercise, you don't know how long the exercise is going to take, you're not going to sleep. Like, you don't need any pressures when you're doing that, I think you have to find a way to distance yourself, and then you take that even further, which is operational tours. And losing. We'll talk about mine later, but losing people and all of that. Like, if your support network is not bringing energy to you, and if it's taking energy from you, you need to move it to the side. Or from a professionalism perspective, like, if you're not completely focused on the people that are under your command, then you're failing in your duty as a platoon commander. And if you're worrying about your family or your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it might be, then of course you need to have a support network, and you need parcels and blueies and Skype calls and all that sort of stuff. But that shows how dated I am using the word Skype, doesn't it? But it can't take energy away from you, because you've got to be putting that energy into the people that you're leading.
Yeah. And also quite interesting there about the support network is, some officers are in the same place as the soldiers here, but by and large the soldiers have come from, especially in the infantry, some challenging backgrounds. Yeah. And if the platoon commander isn't about to give that sort of compassion, they might not be getting it from anywhere else. So I think actually it's a really good point there, is to understand if you're feeling it, probably some of your blokes are as well. That's really interesting in terms of the Sandhurst experience there. You also sort of mentioned Brecon, where we kind of moved on to Brecon a bit, but just to sort of take you back to that late bit of RSB process, I know it can be quite brutal and quite frustrating, and actually working with people now is kind of the thing of, we do AOSB preparation, but really I'm focused on trying to get people to be successful at Sandhurst so they can go to the part of the army they want to go. There would be nothing worse than signing up for a career and not getting to do that career, right? And having to stay in for another 4 years or whatever. So how was regimental selection board for you?
Yeah, so it's not a unique story. Lots and lots of people will have been through, reorganisations and things like that. But I was not a confirmed cadet, but I had very strong relationships with the Royal Gloucester's, Berkshires and Wiltshire Regiment. So my school in Bristol had one of the battalions had famously been entirely officered by my school, and it's plastered all over the dining hall or whatever. And I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do. That was all I ever wanted to do. And then about halfway through Sandhurst, there was a strategic defence review. That was when all the Scots battalions were, the regiments were disbanded and turned into the Scots. That was when the Rifles was created, the Yorkshire Regiment was created. There was lots of disbandments and creations of new organisations that were sort of amalgamating, and they were going to be in a big reorganisation. And my time as a platoon commander would have been managing, admin and new locations and combining different cultures and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, that's not what I want. And I went to my company commander, who I'd had quite a strong relationship with. And I said, look, I need you to help me out here, sir. And he said, well, I happen to know that the Royal Anglian Regiment are going to be doing the summer tour in 2007, or certainly are earmarked for one of the early warfighting tours. So I very quickly sort of switched allegiances and and ended up going through the Royal Anglian process. And at that time, they were literally gearing up for the first non-parachute regiment Royal Marine tour. So it was Paras, what did it go? Paras Marines, Royal Anglians Marines, and then it was Rifles and other sort of organisations. And so we got the first summer warfighting tour. My point there was, because they were gearing up, they had lots of officer berths, and so they were able to sort of accommodate me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I wasn't, maybe the learning point here is, I wasn't afraid to manage my own career. You know, I say to people in the private sector now, is like, forget HR, forget your boss. You are in charge of your career. If you want something, you've got to get it. And I think that's probably a good bit of learning for young officers, is you can get sort of sucked into this massive bureaucracy, and you can assume that your desk officer's got your best interests at heart, or, you know, if you just work hard, you'll get what you deserve. And it's like, actually, you know, sometimes it's like, I want an operational tour, and I need to get an operational tour, and you have to be a bit ruthless in sort of getting what you want. So yeah, and I, you know, as much as that sounds deliberate and all of that, I was incredibly lucky that my company commander happened to know that the Royal Anglians yada yada. But yeah, so I fell into the Royal Anglian Regiment, fell into Essex Company. I ended up having the best 2 years of my life, leading a load of absolute gobshites from Essex, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
We'll come on to that now. Before we do, actually, what you said there about managing your own career, they do, well, definitely when I was at Sandhurst, they were like, this is an officer, and you don't really know how to do it at that point. You're just learning everything about the army for the first time. But definitely sort of the people that were more senior to me and the ones that I saw do it well were very open. Everyone knew what they wanted as their next job, and everyone knew what they wanted as the job after. And that followed me into Civvy Street, actually, when I was working in a tech company, and sort of chatting to people there, like, the boss doesn't know what you want to do next. So you're waiting for this promotion, but he cares about his promotion. So I think it's, you know, just be honest and figure out what it is, and try and drive it for sure, and engineer it backwards if you can.
Yeah, and there's one thing that if we can just go back to talk about AOSB just very briefly, you've just triggered the thought in my mind. So one of the other things that I think it's important to think about from an AOSB perspective is, lots of people will have confidence problems, and I suspect one of the reasons your business does so well is that people need that bit of extra help before going on to really get sort of the best sort of form of their personality out there. But there's also a lot of people on the other end of that spectrum, which is, you know, those people who are probably arrogant, you know, the sort of the quintessential, you know, public school boy types who, you know, have always done very well and have had, you know, a hugely privileged upbringing, of which I was one, by the way. I'm not, you know, I'm being honest. And AOSB is as interested in finding out that you've got the presence to lead, i.e. identifying those people who haven't quite got the DNA from a confidence perspective, but they're not going to take the people that, you know, are feeling, are entitled or aren't, you know, sufficiently humble. And so, you know, there is a game to be played there. Your personality is your personality. And those people that are lacking in confidence have to act up, and those people that are perhaps a bit arrogant have to act down. And I'm not saying you need to be cynical in terms of how you operate, but you definitely need to be in that middle section where you've got the humility to, you know, care about your soldiers and take feedback from your NCOs and that sort of thing. But you've got the confidence that you can lead when things get hard. And some people have just got that naturally, and others need to practice it, and others develop into it. And some people come out of Sandhurst a completely different person to how they went in. So I just make that point there about, you know, they're as interested in that softer stuff and weeding out the arseholes and finding out those people that ultimately haven't got the DNA and haven't got what it takes, as they are assessing your command tasks or your, you know, your fizz or whatever it might be.
Definitely. I will regularly chat to people that you've kind of described there, and, you know, very sort of successful in their younger years, good grades, never really failed at anything.
Yeah.
And then they go to AOSB and they might get through briefing and then fail main board, or they have a bad briefing experience. And it's the first time they've kind of had that setback. And it usually goes one of two ways. One, it's the wake-up call that they need, because at some point in the army, you will fail, whether it's just a platoon attack in training or whether it's, you know, something more serious. You're going to struggle at some point. So how do you bounce back from it? And I actually think AOSB might not do it with this intention, but it is a lesson there in sort of how to bounce back from failure. And I guess you kind of experienced that as well. Or it's the other way, where it's actually, oh yeah, well, I just had a bad day or something like that. And whilst that might be true, the feedback you're given, and you are given a report now, you know, that's not done lightly. They're giving that, and the army is great at direct feedback, as we know. So take that information on board and do something with it. You might have had a bad day, but if they're telling you that you come across arrogant and you don't really get on with people, they're probably right. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and then the second point you thought you triggered in me is, and I see this very, very consistently, both in people I help, and it's half a dozen people. I don't have a business like you, but your family, friends, and that sort of thing. It is lots of people, when I first meet them, always want to talk about what the army can give them. So I want to join the army because of the adventure training opportunities, or because by the time I'm 27 I can walk into any management consultancy or bank I want, and they talk about what it is that it will give them. And I think you have to be very, very careful, particularly in the interview at AOSB, and there are lots of engagements where this can come out in your conversations with the assessors and things. Is yes, be very, very clear on why you are there, and it's okay to be enthusiastic and talk about what you get sort of selfishly from the experience, but you want to have a very, very clear idea of the job it is that you're going to do, why you think you would be good at that job, and what you can offer the army, and what you can offer the people that would be under your command. And I see that very, very consistently. People have looked at the brochures and there's the pictures of climbing and surfing and skydiving and all of that, and they forget that what they're doing is they're asking to be selected to lead soldiers on operations, and I would devote the majority of my why to what you can bring rather than what you get. And it's also, again, just to link it to selection, because I know people are very interested in that, is I ran 2 or 3 officers' weeks, which is the week 5 where officers go away and get hammered for a week on the sort of more psychological leadership type stuff.
Not drunk.
And that one of the ways to catch people out was to just check that they knew the job that they were signing up to do. There's a lot of type A's there. There's a guy who I remember interviewing who was an ex-Olympic rower, 6'6", is a guardsman, generational. You'd look at him and go, well, he's going to be a general someday. Turns out he didn't really know what the job entailed, and he just wanted the badge, and he was a badge collector, and really getting into the nub, and he didn't pass, by the way. Because he didn't know what it would be to be a troop commander and the responsibility and the strategic impact you potentially can have as a troop commander. He wanted to pass selection and say he'd pass selection rather than do the job. And so it's just another little vignette in terms of explaining, make sure you understand what it is that you can offer, not just what you get in return.
I think it's a great point. I kind of sometimes see that with Sandhurst. It's a big attraction, and rightly so. But it's not as grand once you're there. Like it can be a bit challenging at times, and there's some lonely times or whatever. But very quickly, if someone's just talking about, I want to go to Sandhurst, or I can do that adventure training piece or whatever. But what comes after that? Because the army aren't paying for you to go on adventure training much. They really want you to understand that leadership. And it's something that I have probably seen, and we sort of spoke about this the other day, which is people aren't, or there's not many people that I'm speaking to now that are coming across with, the question is, what does the British Army do? And there's not many people answering warfighting. And I think that is something that the Army should be aware of, and I'm sure AOSB are aware of it, and trying to make sure that people do understand that. And it's not just a way to answer a question, it's an understanding of, actually, this is the function.
Well, and if you were to speak to anyone, I've got lots of friends in the infantry, as do you, that is all they're getting ready for. They are getting ready for classic conventional operations. Now there's drones and there's all sorts of new technology, but it's still fundamentally conventional operations in in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah,
frankly.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So maybe we move on to your time and your formative years as a young officer. And this is quite, the stories are still sort of very well spoken at battalion, and I remember getting my letter to say that I was joining C Company, by the way. And we got given the Aid to Afghanistan book, which I don't know if that was about when you were going through, and then basically directed to a few books and the R Wars, and which I'd already watched. And I was very aware of C Company's reputation from the outside. And then when I got in there, I was like, these guys, there weren't, some of the senior NCOs had obviously had combat experience, and some of the junior NCOs. But at that point, the reputation was still very, very proud. And I guess a lot of that stuff was formed over that HERRICK era. So I'd love to get into some of that, and I guess how you found that whole process of taking over a platoon of soldiers, having that sort of first leadership responsibility, and getting ready to go warfighting.
Yeah. I was very lucky that two things. One is when I joined battalion, they'd just started. They'd got back from Iraq the year before, and they were just coming out of the sort of, you have a bit of a lull after your tour. You do your mandatory training, and a lot of the guys are doing courses and that sort of thing. And the battalion was just reassembling to get ready for that first that warfighting tour, and so I turned up at an organisation that was, I hate using the word war because it wasn't war. If people say war fighting, Afghanistan's not war fighting, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But they were on a war footing, and we had the full support of the army. We had the pick of equipment, and we were fully manned, which was sort of not normal to be actually fully manned. Like, I had 36 people in my platoon. That's like unheard of. A platoon commander now would probably be lucky to have 24. Yeah. So I joined an organisation that was really on it, and it had a purpose, and its hackles were up, and it was ready to rock and roll, and that was really cool because that's exactly what I joined the army to do, right? So that was great. So culturally, it was ready to go, and I joined. Literally, my first day in battalion was effectively turning up on a Sunday to draw my weapon to go on I don't know how long Wessex Warrior is or TESX is, but it's maybe 4 weeks, can't remember. But it's a test exercise that then effectively gates a battalion or battle group for operational effectiveness. And so it's a big test for everyone from the commanding officer all the way down. And I literally drew my weapon on the Sunday, and we got on the buses and we went to Salisbury Plain, stayed in that horrendous Nook camp. Yeah. And so I was literally, no officer's mess. I was on a cot bed next to my signaller and next to the blokes. And I say blokes without meaning to be sexist. It was an all male only organisation then. Although we had lots of amazing female medics and female support staff, but at that time, there was like 2 women in the whole battalion or something. So that was awesome, and I just got 4 weeks sitting in trenches, digging trenches, doing ambushes, we pretended to blow a bridge up, and we being chased around by tanks and all sorts of things, and I got to know my platoon. We sat gibbering in the bottom of a trench while it's pissing down with rain for days on end, and we spent time together. And it's difficult to sort of talk about yourself, but I saw it as a real opportunity to show that I was capable. So I made sure that I was always stood up straight, and that I was leading from the front, and I was making sort of good tactical decisions. And I learnt lots of lessons as well. My platoon sergeant at the time was quite experienced. He was just coming to the end of his time as a platoon sergeant, so he was like really, really keen to sort of, we didn't disagree on anything, and he didn't need to grip me at any point, but he was very, very good at sort of saying, think about this and think about that, and now's the time you might go and chat to the blokes, or now's the time you might go and chat with the company commander about this, that, and the other. So he really guided me. And so I think Steve mentioned this, and my platoon sergeant mentioned this in another podcast, which is if I joined battalion and we've been in normal regimental duty routine where the blokes are going off drinking 3 or 4 times a week and everyone's screaming out of camp at 12 o'clock on a Friday, would I have had an opportunity to ingratiate myself or prove myself? No. And would I might have had a slightly worse opinion of my soldiers, because it would have been all the usual sort of personnel issues that you have to deal with as a platoon commander. Whereas, so I had a brilliant opportunity to prove myself, and they had an opportunity to show me that they were fabulous soldiers. And then you get back to camp, and of course you realise they're an absolute nightmare, in terms of their personal lives and things. But I was able to give them the benefit of the doubt because I'd seen them operate, So that was great. And then we went through, 3 or 4 major exercises. We had another 3-week exercise in Norfolk. We had big live firing packages down in. We went to Lyddon Hythe down in Kent. And we had a very long exercise in Kenya, which was, sort of probably only a month or so before we actually deployed to Afghanistan. So very, very rare opportunity to come to an organisation that's gearing up and do lots and lots of training. And that was just an amazing opportunity. So when we deployed, I was on first name terms with all the blokes. It was very informal. We'd been out drinking a lot. I'd been to barbecues at their houses. I'd met their wives. I'd represented a few of them in court. We'd helped a couple of guys out with some credit cards and some car loans and things, and they'd got themselves in a little bit of trouble. And that was a pretty, an unbelievably privileged experience to spend, what would it have been, just over a year with my platoon before we deployed.
So that was all kind of PDT focused. So the battalion knew at that point it was going to deploy on this operation.
Yeah, we didn't do any adventure training. We had obviously a bit of leave here and there, but it was exercise after exercise after exercise.
And everyone was there.
Battle group level exercises, yeah.
And just to maybe put that into perspective, so I got quite lucky in terms of sort of the modern-ish era, I guess it's not that modern anymore, of when I first joined. I went on a ski trip over Christmas, and then I went on the force protection task in Kenya, which obviously isn't punchy at all, but it is a great opportunity to take your platoon away, just you guys, and that was awesome. Then when we got back, I realised what battalion life is like. And everyone is here, there and everywhere. To get your platoon every week, well, it doesn't happen. Everyone's on a course. The officers' mess was a little bit of a mess because people were here, there and everywhere. And then all of a sudden the company deployed to Nigeria. I was the only officer in the company, so I had to stay behind at that point. And it was actually quite hard because no one was there that you needed to be there, and your soldiers weren't there, and one you only knew on a spreadsheet or whatever. And that was quite challenging. And then when we got told we were going on Toril 7, so to Afghanistan, but to Kabul in a completely different type of scenario than you experienced. That was kind of where we did go on a PDT type, conveyor belt. And all of a sudden everyone came back. And I was like, oh, this is great. So yeah, there's actually quite a lot of jealousy that you experienced that part, because it must have just been, I guess a buzz around battalion as well, knowing what was coming up. Should we jump forward to maybe actually deploying then on HERRICK 6? And I don't know where you want to start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just a couple of prelims before we go into the tour. So, I've made the point already, but people who are 19 thinking about AOSB or just about to start Sandhurst or at Sandhurst or whatever, you must keep your eye on what it is that you're joining to do. I mean, there are senior officers in the army and the wider armed forces at the moment who will tell you to your face, without irony, that we will be in a conventional war in the next 3 to 5 years. And they're not saying that because they want people to be doing more training. They're doing it because the analysis is that we will be engaged somewhere in a conventional activity, in the not too distant future. And it's very, very important that people sort of keep that in mind. And your whole preparation needs to be on the basis that you're going to take over a platoon or troop or a unit of soldiers, and you're going to be getting ready for war. And you've got to be on it, because if you turn up and you're not on it, your organisation's not going to take you. That's the other thing about there were, I would say, at least a dozen or so people who, ultimately didn't perform on exercise and got moved into different positions. Senior roles, by the way. This isn't just, someone fails a PFT and whatever, they get moved to military transport platoon. I'm talking about senior NCOs and officers who didn't perform and got moved into different positions. And so you have to have that assumption that you're going to join, at the sort of tip of the spear. And I think that's point number one. Point number two is, on the basis that you're going to be potentially preparing to do that sort of stuff, how do you best want to learn and prepare yourself and your organisation? And I think there's a point about humility there. I mentioned it in terms of AOSB trying to weed out those who have false humility, or those who are sort of overly arrogant. I remember my platoon sergeant, literally grabbing me by the throat when I managed an action on an ambush incorrectly, and telling me that, and I believed him at the time, that he would kill me and leave me on the ground if I did that on tour. And I was like, okay, I've remembered how to manage, a vehicle ambush. We were in vehicles at the time, and it was actions on ambush. I remember having a conversation with my company commander and saying, "Oh, Phil, have you thought about maybe doing it like this?" And he listened to me. And you've got to be ready to have that humility and not be too rigid about how you want to do things. I mean, the most intelligent person in my platoon was a territorial army soldier who joined us 2 weeks before Kenya. He's a fabulous bloke, you know. And he used to whisper to me about stuff that needed to happen, and you know, and you have to have that sort of humility. And so, have the mindset that you're joining to go to war. Otherwise, I think your actions and your preparedness is wrong. But also have the humility that you know you need to get ready yourself. You're not just getting your organisation ready, but you're sort of getting yourself ready.
Yeah, I think that's well, obviously it's really wise advice. There's a lot of conversations that are pinging around in my head recently that I've had where I feel like I'm quite strong on that point, especially now because, you know, I've obviously still got friends that are serving, and I think we've switched from a phase of when I joined, we were back to prepping for a war. We didn't quite know what it is, whereas I think we're now in a phase of prepping for the war. We kind of do know what it's going to look like and how it's going to be. And I think that should be enough of a warning sign for anyone to think, okay, especially if you're going to pick an infantry unit, it's not just to say that you've been in the infantry and do, you know, platoon commander's battle courses, because there's a part of you that wants to go and deliver that on the ground and have that challenge. So I guess maybe going back to deploying, and I guess I'm looking at this through a lens of the sort of lessons that you learnt, the relationships that you had with your NCOs. Wherever you want to start, it's a big question.
There's hundreds of things, but two things that come to mind early doors. One is leading from the front is a sort of an interesting concept. So, and there's a tension now, and this is equally true in the private sector. And you know, it's like, what is the role of a leader? Is it to be at the front? Is it to be enabling? Is it to be, you know, whatever? I had been instructed religiously that the platoon commander should allow the NCOs to do their job, and you know, that you should always be behind the first section, and it should be the lead scout and the section commander that are doing the navigation and are making the sort of the micro movement decisions on the ground, which cover to use, etc. And that's how it's still taught now, right? And that is, by the way, the correct way to teach it. Turned out that actually the platoon was far more effective if I was right up the front, and it went lead scout, who's generally a guy called Ken Fakal, who you should have on, brilliant bloke. Spud Ferrand, who was one section commander, and then me. And if I say that to people now, they go, "Oh, you arrogant wanker! Like, that's not what officers are for. Like, you need to let the section, you know, do its thing, and you're being overbearing and all of that." But we sat down and had a conflab as me and the full screws, the corporals and Steve Arman, the platoon sergeant, and we said, "Look, you know, we're a little bit slow on the ground. I'm struggling to get my message, you know, six men up, and it's a pain in the arse having to use the PRR, and you know, it's company manoeuvres, so there's lots and lots of radio traffic and all this." And we just decided that it would be easier if I was a bit further up the front, so we could make decisions in a more agile way. And if you said that now on platoon commander's battle course, you'd fail, because that's not how an officer should be operating. But I'm just sort of trying to demonstrate that there's a unique, and my platoon were comfortable with me doing that because I'd proven myself, and it made us just a bit quicker on the ground and all that sort of thing. And I remember when I went on selection, and you have to do it's famously called first look, where you do, I think, a 10-minute memorized presentation without notes, and you get absolutely annihilated, and you know, it's all the scripted stuff, and they're just trying to get you to cry, basically. And I talked about that, and they absolutely went for me. It's like, what on earth are you doing at the front? That's not what officers for. And it's like, well, look, that's what I did, and that's what the platoon decided to do. I didn't mandate that would happen, but it just ended up being how we would manage that. And so there's just a point there about, you know, there's no sacred cows. You know, if something works on the ground and you have the relationships to make that work, and you've made that decision almost sort of together, then how you manage your platoon is sort of up to you. And I was, as I said, I was on first name terms, and we had a sort of slightly different way that we moved as a platoon. So there's that was sort of I think the first point I would make is flexibility of mind, and what matters, what works is what matters, and that sort of thing.
I've written down ground/situation dependent, which I'm sure is a phrase that we've both heard a lot. And I remember at Sandhurst constantly being told this phrase. And at Sandhurst, you're kind of looking for the answer to every situation. What if this happens? And what if that happens? The platoon commander it's ground situation dependent. It really depends on what's going on and who's you've got available. And then as soon as you start getting some leadership experience, particularly in the infantry, you start to understand a bit more about what that means. So I'll caveat this with, this is obviously from training, never on a sort of key operations, if you like. But I think it also depends on who you've got there. So if you've got a new commander, a new section commander, and you don't quite trust them as much, or they haven't quite proven themselves, you might want to be further forward. And if you've got someone that you've trusted and has delivered multiple times, you might be more comfortable with being further back. And I think it's one of those things where you just start to know about what it is and when to do it and what feels right. And they're not going to teach that, because at Sandhurst, you've no idea. You know, you're going to do it wrong more than you are right.
Yeah, and they teach humility really well at Sandhurst, I think. You know, they teach you to listen to your senior NCOs and earn the right to lead and all that sort of thing. My experience, and I think if you spoke to any of the other platoon commanders of that era who were doing high intensity operations, I don't know a single person from my platoon at Sandhurst or my friends or, you know, other people in the battalion or regiment, whatever, who where their platoon didn't respond to them when the rounds were coming down. And I think that's probably true if you think back to the Falklands and, you know, you read all the regimental histories and things like that. You know, there are bad officers around, and of course those things always get written about and talked about. But my experience personally, and the experience of my close peer group of platoon commanders, is when it gets nasty, people do look to you. Even the most, you know, distinction in Brecon, you know, they might have a distinction on juniors, distinction on seniors. You know, Steve, you know, my platoon commander, platoon sergeant, had a distinction on both his courses, went on to be the regiment sergeant major, you know, generational guy. He looked to me. And I think that is something that is real, and everyone's shitting themselves. And that is the time for the officer to sort of step up and make some decisions. And there'll be loads of people who are rolling their eyes at that, thinking, oh, well, I can remember this one officer that I worked with who wasn't very good and la la la. But I don't know of any experiences where officers were told to shut up and, you know, sit at the back and all of that. You know, when things are stressful and scary, officers do need to lead.
Yeah.
And sometimes making a quick decision is better than waiting to make a better decision more slowly, particularly when, you know, the enemy's manoeuvring around you and you need to potentially sort of get your blokes into a better position or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the situation I was in as a young platoon commander was extremely, extremely rare. Like I tried to work it out, but let's say I was on tour for 6 months. Let's say I was deployed for 6 months, bit of R&R and stuff. I think there was no more than about 5 or 10 days where I wasn't in some kind of a contact. And on some of those days, it was, you know, complex, high intensity, you know, ambushes and people getting hurt and all of that. Other times it was a few rockets into camp or whatever it might be. But you learn very, very quickly how to operate in those situations and what your men expect and what the right decisions are. And there was a point, I would think, 6 weeks in, 8 weeks in, where we really, really were moving as a very, very high quality sort of cohesive organisation. And the way I sort of best define that is there's a very famous day where we sadly lost Lance Corporal Alex Hawkins, who was killed by an improvised explosive device while collapsing off an ambush. And I was the it's not relevant who was there and who was in charge, but I was one of the officers there, and I was like, all round defence. Oh no, we're already all round defence. Right, clear a safe route. Oh, the lads are already doing that. First aid, lads are already doing that. Who's managing the HLS? You know, and I didn't have to say a word. And there was an hour where there was a guy sadly dying in front of us, and you know, it was an unbelievably stressful situation, and I didn't need to say anything. And that's a sign of a good organisation, right? That's not a sign of weak leadership on my part or a poor organisation. That's a sign of an organisation that's, you know, well led and well practiced and that trusts each other and all that sort of thing. And sometimes it's okay to let things happen around you, particularly if you've had a long time to train and you know everyone and you trust everyone.
Yeah, I mean, initiative, right? And this was sort of, feel weird saying this of likening it to an experience at Catterick, but there was a point where I sort of, you know, you are getting civilians in and trying to train them to be soldiers, which isn't easy. And there's a point where suddenly they just start to do things that they're meant to do. They're meant to be on a knee. They're meant to look that way and not just following their section commander around in, like, they're starting to get it. Okay, we're starting to look a bit more like a platoon here. So I can only imagine what a 6-month, you know, fighting tour would have done to those skills and drills. You've obviously alluded to some pretty harsh stuff there as well. I guess when I'm chatting to people, one of the things is trying to understand this relationship between an officer in the NCOs and how important that is and how you get it right. But I'm also conscious of the fact that I look back and I've probably got it wrong at times as well. Is there anything that stands out in your mind where you're like, oh, that was a bit of a tough lesson that I learned in this way because I got the relationship slightly wrong? Or actually, did it kind of go quite smoothly for you?
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to have a sort of a brilliant anecdote for you on that. I was just incredibly lucky with the people that I took over. So Steve, my platoon sergeant, had just come off a distinction at Brecon. As I say, went on to be the RSM. Me and him were completely aligned on how we wanted to run the platoon in terms of the right levels of aggression, the levels of preparedness we wanted to initiate, how we looked after the blokes. Try to run as horizontal an organisation as possible. Yes, we're in command, but we're not distant and all that sort of thing. So I have to say, I think I got quite lucky in that respect. There are lots and lots of officers who will have had very, very difficult relationships with their senior NCOs, and that can make their 2 years really quite miserable. And that's not only that doesn't need to be a function of competence. It might be that you've got a very competent platoon commander and a very competent platoon sergeant, but sometimes your personalities can just clash. I didn't have that situation. Now, how do you grease the wheels on that? I think I'm not a big drinker, but going out and having a drink and having a bit of fun together can be a really good thing to do. It's just spending time together. Again, I was very, very lucky to spend lots and lots of time with my platoon, and the relationship was natural. I mean, it's tough to answer this, right, because I end up sort of talking positively about myself, which is sort of not really a nice thing to do, but I really tried to be very competent. I tried to be very fit. I tried to make good decisions. I tried to be as compassionate and humble as I could be with the blokes. I genuinely cared about them. And it was easy. And that's a mad thing to say to people that are thinking about joining the army and imagining what high intensity operations looks like. But it never felt challenging. We were never disagreed. Yes, you have to give feedback, and I'll spin a dit in the moment about that. But be a good person.
Yeah.
Be yourself. Be good at your job. Be professional. You are a professional. You are a professional. It's a job. There are standards, personal standards that you have to hold yourself to and hold your team to. But it wasn't a challenge. But the sort of the flip side of that conversation is there is a ruthlessness to command that comes as well. And I did have to effectively sack one of my platoon sergeants because he had not come from the infantry. Well, he was in the Royal Anglian Regiment, but he'd been in mortar platoon for years, and he came with a different ethos. And he was unbelievable mortarman, and he went and had a fabulous career in that space, and he promoted and he did brilliantly well. But he wasn't going to be the person helping me manage 10 platoon on high intensity operations. And I had to have a very, very difficult conversation with the Regiment Sergeant Major about the fact that I wanted him moved. And it's like, you think second lieutenant, mad to be talking to the most senior soldier in the whole battle group to say, I'm sorry, this guy's not cutting the mustard. This is a guy who had 12 more years experience than me. But there is a ruthlessness to command that you need to implement. And if I hadn't removed him, the relationship would have been very, very poor because we would have been culturally misaligned. And the full screws and the lance jacks would have struggled with that as well, and everyone would have seen that. So, being ruthless about the team that you want to select, and you get people, you can't always select your team, but one of the big lessons I tell in the private sector as well is, if someone's not up to it, make the decision and move them. Yeah. Because 9 times out of 10, it's not just helping you, it's also helping the wider ecosystem, because it might be that they're selfish, or they're not as professional as they might be, or they're a bit toxic, or they're energy takers, not energy givers, and all that sort of stuff. First point, I got really lucky, but I did put a lot of work into that, and I tried to be unbelievably good at my job, and that obviously helps. Second point is don't be afraid to be ruthless about maintaining the standards in your platoon, and sometimes that means holding people that are much more experienced than you to account. The standard is the standard.
Just to sort of touch on that, I remember being told, and I can't remember who said this to me, but it stuck with me, and it was a senior NCO when I was invited over to the Sandhurst mess at Christmas time, and actually Steve was there with the yard of ale to welcome me. And someone said to me, if the platoon is running smoothly and the soldiers, the blokes are, everything's where they should be, etc., you guys, you and the platoon sergeant, are doing a good job. If things start to unfold and people aren't where they need to be and they don't know what's going on, one of you or both is messing up. And I always actually thought it's both. It's never going to be just one because someone's not got a grip on it. And I think that's actually a really good sort of learning of what you've shared there.
Yeah.
Moving on to, I guess, what must have been a pretty arduous experience going on to Special Forces selection. Just how did you time that? I know that you went after being a platoon commander, right? Did a stint as 2IC and then went, is that right?
Yeah, so on HERRICK 6, so I'd have been a lieutenant at the time. I'd have been in 2 years, 2 years post Sandhurst. I asked the commanding officer on tour, so he came to Fob Inkerman and we were just chatting, and I said, sir, would you approve my application to do Special Force selection? And he sort of smiled at me and said, only if you get a gold in the Cambrian Patrol, because we were due to do a Cambrian Patrol sort of 6 weeks after we got back. He would have always let me go, but anyway, he was just sort of winding me up a bit. Anyway, we got a gold on Cambrian Patrol, and then sadly had to give up 10 platoon, which was a terrible day in my life, worst breakup I've ever been through. And then I did a very short period as A Company 2IC under Dom Biddick, who is now extremely senior. I think he's the Chief of Staff of the Army now. He had done Special Reconnaissance Regiment selection as a young officer and had not been well looked after, and he was, there was a bit of jealousy, and he hadn't been sort of well looked after, and he sadly, wasn't successful in doing that, and he was determined that I wouldn't have that experience, and so yes, I did a bit of time in Northern Ireland doing some support to PSNI stuff, which was great fun. I effectively had 6 months to prepare, so I promoted to captain on Officers Week. So that gives you a sense of how quickly I did it. And by the way, there'll be people on here who go on and do selection one day. I wouldn't do it as early as I did it. I think I could have done with another, recce platoon or gone and done a training job or something like that. I probably would have been a better Special Forces troop commander if I'd spent a bit more time doing stuff. I mean, incredibly operational experience, but perhaps didn't have that wider army planning process, stuff, because platoon level operations is still quite sort of granular. But again, I was determined that that's what I wanted to do. I split up with my then girlfriend, and I was like, I'm going on selection, and I'm going to pass, and that's that, and I'm not going to quit, and all that sort of thing. So I put my mind to it, and I was very, very lucky to be supported by the battalion in doing so.
Awesome. Literal separation from what we touched on last time.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I do get a lot of questions, and I obviously have had friends go down in some successful, some not. And it's always quite a difficult one to time, I found. I mean, even myself, I never went and did selection, but I never wanted to give up platoon command. And then I think, whatever happened after, I sort of just didn't fancy it. But there was definitely a period where, and people ask now is, at what time should I do it? When's the right time? How much experience do you need? I guess it varies on the person massively. But actually, it's interesting that you felt like you did it, and you were successful, that you felt like you did it slightly too early, and if you did it again, maybe delay it slightly. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think I think there's a little bit of luck involved. Do you get injured? Are the people that are assessing you at the time, how focused are they on operational experience versus the raw materials of you as a person? I think everyone has a sort of slightly different experience of selection. I mean, I've helped half a dozen people try, one of whom has now badged. In fact, badged very recently. But I really only say three things to them, which is don't quit, because the vast majority of people self-select off selection, particularly in the first sort of 6 months where you have the aptitude phase in the hills and then the jungle. Don't be a dick. And people say, oh, bloody hell, Sam, but that if you don't quit, and if you are a good team player, and then you don't make the same mistake more than once, you can pass selection. I don't want to sort of trivialize what is, tier one, Special Forces selection, but any competent, physically fit infantry soldier or officer should be able to pass Special Forces selection. It's raw soldiering. Admittedly, it's bloody hard, and the jungle in particular is just hideous, but it is basic soldiering. in unbelievably arduous circumstances, and they play mind games on you, and the hills is very, very challenging. But I don't psych yourself out. If you've thought of yourself as a sort of a top third type on your various courses, either as a soldier or as an officer, then it should be achievable.
Awesome, Sam. Before we sort of wrap up, any final comments or thoughts on, I guess, this sort of lessons in leadership podcast?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd love to do another one because there's so much stuff that's now sort of come to mind. But I'll try and sort of some final thoughts, which hopefully are interesting and perhaps sort of stimulate people's imaginations who are listening to this. So I've tried to sort of write down 5 things that I think would capture a very, very high quality army officer. And every time I write this list, it'll be subtly different. But this is not in terms of how to lead, but in terms of who you would be as a person. How you would define yourself as a person as a leader. I think leadership is about presence, and what that leads to a debate about sort of nature versus nurture. How, to what extent can you learn the raw materials of leadership versus is it just innate? Is it just part of your DNA and your early years as a child and all that sort of stuff? I'm not going to get into that debate, but some people have a presence that is very, very obvious. They own a room, and it might not be that they're the loudest person, but it's the person that everyone looks to and the person that just has that sort of natural presence. And so, for those people who are lacking in confidence, and for those people who are perhaps the other end of the spectrum, we talked about that earlier, think about what it is who are those people that you look up to, those seminal leaders. What is it that defines their presence? And I promise you it's not arrogance. But I also promise you that they do have to have a bit about them. So there is that sort of continuum of arrogance versus anxiety and a lack of confidence. You must have presence, and it can't be faked. It has to be real presence. And some people won't learn that till they're in their mid-20s or even their 30s. And some of that is just innate. Some of that just is in you. There's an intellect point, in leadership. I think you should be constantly trying to stretch your intellectual boundaries. I'm not just talking about academics. I'm talking about reading books and understanding the world around you, and leadership theory versus current affairs versus interest. Anything that potentially would sort of differentiate you from a soldier. The point of having officers is that they are able to lead, and what is it that differentiates them? Well, they should be fitter, they should be smarter, they should be more natural leaders, and I think it's a part of leadership that is not talked about enough, is just that intellect. I think that's a point that can be worked on. I think being personable and humble. I don't know the degree to which I've done a good job of explaining that, but you can't fake it in front of soldiers. They will just spot you an absolute mile away. And if ultimately you don't care about other people, you don't have emotional intelligence, you don't have a sort of a compassionate mindset, you're probably not going to be a good leader, either in the army or in the private sector. And actually, it's perfectly okay. I've got lots of people in my team in my current job where, do you know what? They're not ever going to be good leaders, but they're brilliant technicians, and they're specialists in whatever it is that they do, and that's okay as well. I'm not being disparaging of people that don't have those leadership qualities, but you've got to be personable, you've got to be humble. There's something about always wanting to be better, and again, it's a platitude, and all the generic high performance podcasts and stuff will always talk about always getting a bit better and marginal gains and all that sort of thing. But I do think that the best leaders I've worked for have always had a mindset of improvement and achievement, and not just within themselves, but also within the sort of the teams that they lead. So a mindset of always getting better. What is it that you can do to make your organisation better? What is it that you can do to help your people? What is it that you can do to make yourself more credible or better? And then the final point, I think, is perhaps a slightly subtly more, this is maybe the private sector commercial thing coming out of me, but there's something about conscientiousness. I mean, there is some interesting analysis which says that conscientiousness is the determining factor in those people who go on to be very, very senior leaders. So look at, generals and above in the army, look at, chief executive officers of FTSE 100 companies. Conscientiousness is one of the most closely correlated character traits with highly successful people. What standards do you set? What standards do you tolerate? And all that sort of thing. And then one other thought, and this is a good friend of mine sort of suggested this to me today when we were talking about me doing this evening. He said, do you know what the best preparation for a young officer would be before going to Sandhurst would be go and get a job as a junior manager in a McDonald's, or go and wait tables, or go and work in Starbucks or something like that, and just go and spend time doing something that perhaps, particularly if you're, public school, whatever, go and spend time doing something that just grounds you in what it is to lead people in gritty, low-paid, stressful situations. Yeah. And I had never thought of that, but I thought it was such a brilliant point, and I thought I'd just share that with everybody. If there'll be guys here who, have had led very privileged lives, going and doing 6 months in the local McDonald's or in the local pub, I think will really genuinely help you to be a better leader.
Yeah, and I think, try and motivate that team when people are on part-time hours and they're young and hungover and whatever. I think that's definitely a challenge, and you don't have the privilege of ordering people around. I heard someone say the other day, actually a bit of a sales leader, and he said, to motivate the team, we used to offer more money. And I challenged him to say, well, you can't do that in the army. So how are you going to motivate your soldiers if you can't do that? And it's bonds. And to add on to that, I've written these down. I think they're great points. I think what's shone through, Sam, speaking to you and you've mentioned the words yourself, is this genuine care. And that's authentic. And I think that's actually really important, because if you think of the soldiers where you really, really invested in them, and I know this for myself, like we probably had the best relationship, and they probably got the most out of me and I got the most out of them. And it's not by fault or by accident that relationship happened. It's because I really tried to deliver. And if I had done that with everyone and continue to do that with everyone, then only good things can come from that. Even if we don't quite get the result, it's the best way to do it. And I think that's definitely something that's rang true from this situation, which sounds like you've carried throughout, which is great. We're at time, so that's that. So thanks very much for coming in. Guys, that is it for this week's podcast. This is episode 2. Episode 3 will be en route. If you like this stuff, please click like. If you're watching on YouTube, click subscribe, click the bell so you're notified every time I upload a video. And please do share your thoughts. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. I will do my best to get back to you and give you sort of the information that I know. But this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, this junior leadership, because I think it's a steep learning curve for many. And I know there's so many of you out there that are just trying to prepare as best as you can. There won't be better lessons than today. And actually, hopefully, the thing that's sort of shone through here is it's all actionable. And it's all actionable no matter what stage of the process you are. They're kind of some key themes that ring true. So hope this was enjoyable. Any comments, put below. Cheers.